Welcome back to the Tuesday Triggers podcast. Super excited for this guest. He is an old friend of mine and a friend to agencies and a friend to people who need to do outbound. Um, Welcome, Michael Benson. How's it
Hey,
going,
what's going
man?
on? Yeah, thanks for having me, Christian. How are you?
I'm great, man. So to give the viewers here and to give everyone a little bit of a background, I came across you when you created Warm Up Inbox, like, I don't know, a lifetime ago.
Yeah, it seems like a lifetime ago.
Right? And actually tried to build a warm up tool at the time. And you guys were the picture of what I was trying to build. Unfortunately, I hired a shitty dev team and never finished the tool. And by the time I was done, everyone and their mother had a warm up tool, so I never finished it. But you were the what I strove to be, and you had no idea, by the way.
Oh, that's great.
And then you started Mailreef, and we crossed paths again. And I remember getting on a call with you and being like, wait, are you Mike Benson? Are you the Mike Benson? They're like, hey, what's up, man? So
Yeah.
Mike Benson, you founded and built Mailreef, what, probably 2 years ago now?
Yeah, funny enough, it's been 4 years. It's probably just been like time's flown. Yeah. So it's funny. I created Warm Up Inbox and like Mailreef around the same time.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it was one of those things where the warm up was so apparent where like everybody like Lemlist had it and we were like, hey, like this is so expensive. Let's make something cheaper because like we were just burning all our money at the agency on warm up. But basically, as our network started flooding at Warm Up Inbox, we were like, people just kept asking us how to automatically create mailboxes. And we were like, well, you can't for Google or Microsoft. And then that's when we started like going down this rabbit hole. And actually like our first work was actually just like seeing if this was like physically possible and legally possible. Those were kind of the two things. So as Warm Up Inbox was growing, Mailreef was growing too. So it was about 4 years ago, but we sold Warm Up Inbox, almost like 3 years ago to this day, actually. So pretty close.
Cool, man. I have a million questions about the intricacies here, but for all intents and purposes, why don't we or could you give everyone listening an explanation of what makes Mailreef different than other inbox setups?
Sure. Yeah, yeah. Best way to kind of describe it is kind of the landscape in general, right? So on one side you have Google and Microsoft mailboxes. Typically you connect to those through, two-factor authentication. You're typically sending them through a Google or Microsoft API. And then on the flip side, you have like your SMTP providers, which are like your Mailguns and your SendGrid, which are, basically built for high volume, high sending. Issue with those sometimes is ultimately they don't allow for cold email at times. Sometimes you can kind of jerry rig them to get them to work for cold email, but kind of to receive the inbound replies from the SMTP, you still need some sort of mailbox on the other side. So best way to look at Mailreef is we kind of took both of these concepts and kind of glued them together. So Mailreef is definitely an SMTP provider. Our output is SMTP and IMAP, but their individual mailbox is kind of built on what we call is like a single server. And so what's kind of cool about that is kind of similar to a SendGrid or a Mailgun. You still can control your dedicated your dedicated IP addresses and control all your outbound deliverability and everything like that. But it's controllable within our system, meaning that you can actually split out multiple servers. If something goes wrong, it's a lot more easily digestible to fix versus like say a Google or Microsoft where you're kind of on this huge shared network pool. Some weeks it's going to work, some weeks it's not, but obviously it's still Google or Microsoft. So what we're seeing in the industry these days is Mailreef is typically one cog in a bigger wheel. We see, the best agencies in the world, they'll use Google, hand registered, Google resellers, Microsoft registered, layering in some Mailreef. There's some other like really cool tools out there coming out that are like really trying to, kind of thread the needle on some of these general concepts. But funny enough, I mean, in general, there's only so many ways you can send an email. So at the end of the day, a lot of these kind of, SMTP has been around for a lot of years. So a lot of the kind of stuff that we're working on Mailreef isn't anything drastically new. It's just kind of layering it and kind of hyper focusing it for cold email. Yeah.
Yeah, we use I think 7 providers now at
Yeah.
any given time. So it's a game of diversifying risk, right? Like
Right.
we see changes and things happen and we can't explain them, and we're certainly not like, yeah, we have a team that around this, but like no one that's like on the other side of the veil that like works at Google that can tell us what the hell is going on. So it is a game of certainly of cat and mouse. And
And
this
then
is
how are you managing that, by the way? I'm just kind of curious. Like that's one thing that we see with our clients where everybody is kind of layering in their own unique systems, right? And I know I would say you're a little bit more advanced than some of the other agencies just on the tech side, but just kind of curious, like, do you pipe all the replies into one kind of central UI? Is it a smart lead, or is it instantly, or is it all the above? I'm just kind of curious because that's like, we on our side, we deliver, kind of leave it up to the client to do what they want with it. And the nice part is people do come up with their own systems, but I was just kind of curious.
Everyone comes up with their own system. So we have our own system that we have. It's like proprietary. We built it ourselves. We've built it on the backbone of actually our SaaS tool, which is RevReply. So RevReply is like an AI appointment setter. It sits in your inbox. And so all of it's funneled to a master inbox. And then RevReply, our tool, picks it up and responds like an AI SDR or BDR, and like, overcomes objections, gets back to people in 3 minutes. It sends them booking links. It looks at your
Oh,
calendar,
wow.
does everything that you need. So we've tried to remove some of the noise from people to make it an easier process. But getting there was not easy. And unless you are fully focused on this, like there's even just benchmarking and testing different providers is so incredibly difficult because everyone is different. Every campaign is different. Every targeting, like you cannot no targeting is exactly the same. So even if you take a list and split it in half and put it against two providers on fresh systems, like there's all kinds of like things that are
Yeah.
are not
There's so many
control.
variables.
So
Yeah.
many variables, right?
Yeah. And like to even get like statistically significant data, you'd need to send so much volume, which is crazy. I mean, we see some really sophisticated tests, and one week we'll be in first, next week we'll be in third, and then it's like, and then all of a sudden you kind of look at it over a course of like 2 months, and you're like, oh, they're about the same. It's just really funny to see how they average out.
Yeah, I mean, we're close with Vibov, and even him, like we're in some group channels together where it's fairly private chats, and it's like he'll come in and be like, take this with a grain of salt. Even though I've seen this across like 5 million emails, like take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there was a span of like maybe, I don't know, 7 or 8 weeks ago where they were like, okay, if you have pork bun and Microsoft, I think like Smartly mentioned it, they're like, we're seeing something funky. And it's like, we see some of those patterns too, but the best part is that things change pretty frequently. And I guess that's where it's where diversification comes in, right? Like our inbound channel at Mailreef's hilarious. Like we just get inbounds on days that Google and Microsoft just have like a rainy day, and it's not saying that Google and Microsoft's ever like over, right? It's just like today's going wrong. And I mean, we'll have a span of 3 or 4 days of just demo calls where people are saying the same thing. There was a big Microsoft thing a couple of weeks ago that corrected itself, those types of things. So
Yeah. Yeah, I've met a few people that are on like behind the fold and like that like are in this upper echelon of the people determining how spam filters work and stuff. And it's really interesting, but and you could never pin anything down, and they also are very secretive. It's crazy how
it is crazy. Yeah.
yeah.
And I would love to like, we try to obviously reverse engineer some of it. But yeah, I mean, ultimately it's a black box. One interesting thing is though, is if you do pony up and pay a lot of money for some of these like high level enterprise like spam filter systems, it is wild to understand how much data they have. Like, great example is like you start sending emails on day one, like to like blacklists and reputation networks, you sent 35 emails today,
Really?
off your IP. And it's wildly accurate. Like we would run some tests, small scale tests, see if we could fly below the radar. 50 emails. I mean, they're within, 5 to 10% accuracy on just like general volume. And so, when you kind of compare Google or Microsoft to Mailreef, there are some like intricacies that you need to kind of follow with Mailreef. Part of the reason why we like require a call and do a little like very light screening is more like, hey, what are you trying to do? Who are you reaching out to? And is Mailreef even the best solution for that? And
Yeah.
that's where like diversification in general, when people don't know where to start, whether it's like, whether you have run campaigns or you're new to cold email, you kind of take people's, like take their words with a grain of salt, as you mentioned. But, if you do have diversification, you can at least get a kind of general side of like where things are going, and really just like ultimately using reply rates and like some deliverability tests like are really, really helpful. And that kind of like at least gives you a small flashlight in like a dark cave.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, honestly, that's what we go off of oftentimes because we don't track open rate anymore. We haven't tracked open rate for probably 2 years. And so we can kind of just tell by looking at a reply rate of 3, 4, 5 campaigns. And if it gets down below a certain threshold, we're like, yeah, something's kind of concerning here. Question for you. When we first started talking and you had said, and so this is going to lead to my next question, which is tell us about how your infrastructure works, how you could set it up, what you could put on it, because I think that that's important. You guys have some very significant differentiators there. But when we first started talking, you were like, I was flirting with this idea of not warming.
Yeah.
And at the time, you're like, no, you still got to warm with us. Is
Right.
that still the case? Have you seen anything against like
It's
not
it's a
necessarily?
it's a great question. And it's that's like the holy grail, right? To be able to send on like day one. And like there are some providers that, are essentially saying, hey, start to fire off on day one, right? And if you kind of start to peel back the curtains a little bit, they do say kind of ease into it, right? You can't like say if you're doing 25 cold a day per box, like you can't just fire it out 25 per day per box. You do want to ease into it. Ultimately, we still say warm up for 14 days. If somebody comes in like a total panic, we ultimately kind of say, hey, you can kind of tweak it for this 7 days, but again, kind of ease into it.
Yeah.
Obviously, sometimes like a lot of people come in panic. So that
That's when
basically like,
people come in is like, oh, after like 3 days after they've already started ripping their hair out and they've got bald spots, is that's when they come to you and they are like, okay, help me.
typically, yeah, we're kind of like, because obviously we're a little bit more expensive than like, say just getting one Google box, but they're kind of probably going to your next question. It's like you can kind of mold and customize our servers to like a specific thing if you need, but it is sometimes like not the most cost prohibitive. It's more like, okay, I got a really important client, like I just want to have an extra data point that we can kind of talk about on our recap calls. But yeah, ultimately warm up is like emails off your server, domain reputation, and your mailbox reputation. It's kind of those three combined. If you buy a new domain or even bring in an old domain and attach it to a new system, it's almost like you're kind of shocking the system a bit. And if you kind of come out the gates super fast, it's a little bit alarming, excuse me, especially to the blacklist. So kind of going back to that, like they know your number right away. If you look at certain reputation pools, some are public, some are private, but they'll actually know your volume, and that's actually half the battle. So sometimes like somebody might reach out to us and say, hey, our warm up reputation scores 2 days in look horrible. I've never seen this before. Sometimes it actually has to do with the ramp up speed where you're just kind of like shocking the system. That being
Really?
said, like Mailreef is a different system than a Google or Microsoft. So you do have a little bit more wiggle room on a Google or Microsoft. Ultimately, that warm up is actually tricking Google and Microsoft's algorithms. You kind of already have some baked in reputation for Google or Microsoft because it's Google or Microsoft. For us, like that warm up still is really needed a bit. Yeah.
Now you talked about like your IP can kind of be burnt or whatever. Like that concept is still can be a little confusing to me. So when you're
Sure.
talking about that, are you talking about the IP from where things are being sent from the SMTP server, from Smart Leader Instantly, or like where's that IP getting tacked on along the
Sure.
pathway?
Yeah. So, yeah, one kind of general complaint that you kind of hear for any kind of email service provider is like, oh, the warm up pool's broken, or the Smart Leads having issues this week. Like, let's all move to Instantly. They're doing better. For the most part, the email sender tools really don't have that much like stake in the game. Yes, kind of the way that they connect to a Google or Microsoft API to send. there is some like probably some secret magic behind the scenes there. But ultimately, the best way to kind of look at the stack is, yeah, you have a server with an IP address. And when you send an email out, it's every email's being stamped with an IP. You know, with Mailreef, it's your same IP. If you actually open up the Google guidelines and say, hey, what's a good deliverability? They say they want one static IP. And so we actually built it specifically for Google. You know, our best use cases are delivering to Google. And we actually think it's because of that specific, like there's like 9 bullet points. That's one of them in Google's guidelines. So you could actually, on any stack, whether it's Google, Microsoft, Mailreef, you could actually have things burn in multiple stages. So sometimes an email address itself gets burned. It's pretty rare. You don't really see it too often, but it can happen. What's most common is domains get burned. You buy 5 domains, you know, you see 1 or 2 not doing well, but the other 3 are doing great. That's actually an immediate sign that domains are burned, but your server is actually still fine, whether it's a Google or Microsoft server. Reason being is actually if a server goes down or an IP, and this can happen, your Google IP pool could go down. That's what you see a lot with Google resellers. Google resellers are so spotty. They are amazing. If you find good ones, I always tell people, if you find a good Google reseller, don't tell anybody.
Right.
But it's because of that pool. So Google pools could get burned. We actually think about 15 to 20% of Google IPs are on a blacklist at any given point. Mailreef, it's certainly possible as well. You know, say you just basically it's volume off the server and your spam to click ratio. So if that number gets high, domains start to burn and it can trickle up to the server. And that's ultimately where, you know, we kind of come in and say, if people are saying, hey, all my domains are looking bad, that's when we say, all right, let's peel back the curtain. Let's see, like, if we can actually, you know, start to, like, basically we're determining if the server's bad. In that case, we swap it. It's pretty rare to swap it, but we certainly have done it. And it just really matters of like how good of a cold email you are, or sometimes the industry, if you're emailing big enterprises, they have automatic like spam ratios where they're kicking it immediately back to the blacklist. It's unbelievable. You send an email to somebody at apple.com, they hit spam. It's literally in like the blacklists, like mailbox in milliseconds. And like basically that domain burned almost immediately, at least to the
Really?
enterprises. So it's really
Wow.
interesting. Yeah.
Crazy. That's interesting.
Yeah.
All right. So 2 last questions.
Sure.
One, I come to you, I've got money in my hands. I'm saying, hey, everything is on fire. Here's my money. Explain, because you guys have a very unique setup. Explain what I'm getting and what I can do with that.
Sure.
Part 2 of the question, and I'll ask it again once you get to the end of this question, but part 2 will be, you know, what should people, what should be standard practices and settings and rules that you should be abiding by, like the Holy Bible. So
Sure.
part 1, I come to you with money. My everything is burning, you know, and what am I getting from Mailreef?
Sure. Yeah. So we take a slightly unique approach with pricing. Reason being is you can kind of like control the dial in a couple of different ways. But kind of step 1 is we're $249 a month per server is what we call it. We actually don't charge by mailbox. You can like we literally have a client that has a couple hundred mailboxes on a server and really gets the cost down. We really only have 2 line items on our entire bill set that are basically mandatory. It's a $249 a month per server, and then we charge a 0.001 per outbound email. And so part of the reason why we charge usage instead of like per mailbox is ultimately we actually want to incentivize you to try not to send as much volume. Kind of the idea in cold email in general, whether it is Google, Microsoft, or Mailreef, more volume out and the more spam clicks, worse deliverability is. It's a very easy formula. And so because you get a dedicated server, it comes with a dedicated IP. Literally everything is so different. So, you know, if you sign up and you take Christian's mailbox and compare them to each other, nothing is the same. Might as well be a different company. It's that isolated. Basically, what you can do is you can kind of configure the server according to what you're actually already used to. That's kind of the best case where if you are doing Google or Microsoft, say it's 1 domain, 2 mailboxes, or 1 domain, 15 mailboxes. What's kind of nice is you can bring that right in, get your benchmarks, and kind of go into that variable idea of like, we want you to eliminate as many variables to just at least get some benchmarks against like what you're used to. And so typically what we see is clients just generally put about 100 mailboxes on a server. When you kind of average out all our like fancy math, it really comes out to about $3.50 a mailbox. So, maybe a little bit more than a reseller, but cheaper than a hand registered Google. And basically you can kind of control that.
Yep. All right. So if I'm not mistaken, there is some limitations on it, right? So like, again, I could come in and I could put on like 50 domains, and I could put on 3 outboxes per each of those, and have 150 outboxes. And for those, I could send, low volume sending, and I need to do some warming. And each server can handle a max capacity of 100,000 emails.
That's
Correct?
exactly right. That was the final part that I did miss was basically what we suggest on a server. Like in theory, a server is unlimited, but like that's where we charge the usage. But yeah, where we basically call them bumpers, where we say a server should really only do 50,000 cold emails a month, and we suggest pairing that with a 1-to-1 cold to warm ratio, so 50,000 warming emails.
Yep.
So if you do 10,000 cold emails a month from our infrastructure, pair it with 10,000 warming emails. So that's kind of the final piece to it. So we actually only look at volume off the server as kind of the number one metric for kind of like, hey, is your server looking okay?
Yep.
Where a lot of people kind of start to kind of test and bring in their own systems is actually more domain kind of diversification. Reason being is domains burn way earlier than a server. So,
Yep.
we literally have clients on the same server for 3.5 years, and they've done a couple of rounds of recycling through domains. And so that's something that, I would say a lot of the bigger agencies totally understand, where it's all day long, you're recycling through domains, monitoring domains. But that's something that we always like to suggest is like, even when things are good, whether it's Google, Microsoft, us, like layer in some more domains, kind of get that recycling, because that's ultimately where, like, if somebody writes in the Mailreef and they say, hey, we have an issue, we look at it and we go, hey, all your domains are burned, and like we just add a new one real quick to test, and it's like it's fine. So, especially to Gmail looks at domains very heavily, and you do 1 or 2 things wrong in 1 or 2 days, that domain's gone. So we see domains they could burn in 5 days. They can burn in 3 years.
We do it all the time,
Yeah,
man.
yeah, and but people forget that too sometimes. So then they kind of say, "Oh, we got to try this new system," and it's like we actually tell people that all the time. They come from like Google or Microsoft. They say Google or Microsoft doesn't work for me, and I'm like, it's Google or Microsoft. It should work for you. Like, you got to replace these domains.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
100%.
So
Awesome, man. Thank you
cool.
so much for your time.
No problem.
As always, great chatting with you. Hope to catch up again soon.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me.
Great. Cheers.